Supreme Court says they won't immediately hear a case that would repeal Act 10, which would give collective bargaining rights to tens of thousands of public employees. Likely the court won't consider that case until after the April election. Justice Janet Protese was also rejecting a request to recuse herself from that decision. Republican leaders previously filed a motion saying she should not hear the case because she voiced opinions about the case in the 2023 campaign. Conservative Judge Brian Hagedorn withdrew from the case at the end of last month. He helped write the law when he served as then Governor Scott Walker's legal counsel.